So I will introduce Reverend Dr. J.R. Norwood, who is a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, where he served as Principal Justice of the Tribal Supreme Court, as a councilman, and as the senior minister to the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Christian Prayer Circle Ministry. He is the co-chair of the Task Force on Federal Acknowledgement of the National Congress of American Indians and the General Secretary of the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes. He has represented his tribe at the national and international level and has written about and lectured on tribal history, culture, religion, and current concerns. Since 1992, Dr. Norwood has served as the senior pastor of the Ojima Village Christian Church of Ewing, New Jersey, and he's also the founder and director of the Christian Mission School of Theology. He is also a member of our Center's Advisory Commission. So welcome, Reverend Norwood. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor Krasner. It's good to be here. Welcome to everyone who's here with us. I have the honor of moderating this particular panel and have the honor of introducing the panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Jeff Benvenuto. He is an adjunct professor of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. He's a contributing co-editor of Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America, which was published by the Duke University Press in 2014. He is published in the Journal of Genocide Research and Genocide Studies and Prevention, and he is currently co-authoring a book on critical genocide studies and prevention, as well as revisiting his dissertation work on human rights, settler colonialism, and the normalcy of assimilation. Our next speaker is Dr. Kerri Malloy, who is Yurok Karuk. He is a lecturer in the Department of Native American Studies at Humboldt State University. His research focuses on indigenous genocide, healing, and reconciliation in North America, and the necessity of systemic change within structures to advance transitional justice. He is a doctoral candidate in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies PhD program at Gratz College. He has received his Master of Jurisprudence in Indian Law from the University of Tulsa College of Law and his Bachelor of Arts in Native American Studies and Economics from Humboldt State University. He is a public fellow in religion and the American West of the New York Historical Society, researching the significance and development of the Indian Shaker Church in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome so much, gentlemen. It's an honor to have you with us for our program this evening. We'll be beginning by having each of you, beginning with Dr. Benvenuto, then moving on to Professor Malloy to give us an introduction about your work, the various interesting areas that you're doing research and lecturing, and telling us perhaps even a little more about your experiences than we could have gotten from the bios. Dr. Benvenuto?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and try sharing my screen. I hope this shows up. Let's see. Okay, is this showing up for everyone? All right. Well, thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging our presence on the traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. Thank you as well to my fellow speakers, Kerri Malloy and Reverend Norwood. And thank you as well to Barbara and the Mercer County Holocaust and Genocide and Human Rights Center for hosting this event. I want to start by disturbing what may be a taken for granted notion that genocide is somehow a foreign problem, that it's something that other people do, not us. Look at this cover image from Samantha Power's highly acclaimed book about America and genocide. Those eyes peering through the window blinds are suggestive. It's as if they're seeing genocide happen somewhere out there in the world beyond the safe confines of our domestic abode. But what's going on inside the house? What's hidden from sight? How does this foreign gaze inhibit our ability to see genocide closer to home? As we dive into this question, let's confront the big picture. On the eve of 1492, there were probably about 7 million indigenous peoples north of the Rio Grande. But by the turn of the 20th century, there were only 375,000. That's an approximately 95% population decrease in the span of 4 centuries, a cataclysm by any measure. Genocide was certainly part of the equation here, but it wasn't necessarily the general cause. For that, we turn to the concept of settler colonialism, which is a transnational historical phenomenon that characterizes the United States, as well as other English-speaking countries like the United Kingdom, specifically in Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Settler colonialism isn't simply a thing of the past. The traces of history are built into these modern political boundaries. It's easy to take the lines on this map for granted, as if they've always been there. But what did this political geography look like before the Europeans came? This map gives us a glimpse at the diversity of indigenous North America. These are just some of the hundreds of distinct groups that make up the Onkwohonwe, which is the Iroquoian word for the original peoples in this part of the world. It's important to note that these boundaries are not strictly concrete, unlike the modern geopolitical borders we just saw. Instead, we see here a significant degree of territorial overlap. This map also speaks to the diversity of indigenous experiences of colonialism on a grand scale across an entire continent over the past half millennium and beyond. Since 1492, there hasn't necessarily been a total, relentless, and pervasive genocide in the Americas. Rather, we have to zoom down to the local level to see genocide, to see the particular conditions that made genocide possible in specific places and time. So let's return to this map. This is Lenapehoking, or the homeland of the Lenni Lenape. There are probably about 10,000 Lenape in 1600. By the mid-19th century, there were maybe 1,000. Like many other indigenous peoples, however, the Lenape are resilient, and there's been a dramatic demographic rebound as they've become a diasporic people. But as far as our regional geography is concerned, the Lenapehoking no longer exists as a geopolitical entity. That's why the state boundaries are superimposed on this map. The same is true across the entire continent, and this is a key point. At its core, settler colonialism fundamentally involves the usurpation of sovereignty. It's about political control and territorial domination. It's about erasing these fluid boundaries of existence and replacing them with a strictly ordered property regime. The foreign gaze of genocide prevents us from seeing indigenous geopolitics. I stress the word geopolitics because indigenous peoples were neither bloodthirsty barbarians nor noble, peaceful savages. There was a much deeper legacy of power and conflict that preceded colonialism. With that said, genocide was not a feature of pre-contact indigenous warfare. This point is supported by indigenous oral traditions. For example, the Ratinoshoni, or the traditional Iroquoian origin story, describes a period of endemic warfare, roughly between 1000 and 1300 AD. At some point thereafter, the arrival of a great prophet known as Daganawida, or the Great Peacemaker, delivered the Great Law of Peace, which is the oral constitution for the multinational indigenous confederacy known as the Haudenosaunee, aka the Iroquois League. Originally comprised of 5 autonomous nations, the Tuscarora became the 6th member of this political union after migrating from the mid-Atlantic in the 18th century. So in a way, this confederacy was the original United Nations. Even though militarism was a feature of this pre-contact geopolitical history, there is no evidence of total warfare or the utter extermination of enemies. Traditional tribal warfare was usually of a restricted nature, sometimes even involving adoption rituals, as depicted here, where enemy captives would be assimilated into the in-group in order to replenish the spiritual power of the community. Given such constraints, genocide was a rare, if not entirely absent feature of pre-contact indigenous warfare. The invention of genocide in indigenous North America was a result of European-induced conflicts. The original 17th century Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam was established as a regional node in a global economic network, as European imperial rivals competed for access to indigenous trade partners who could supply a growing fashion demand in Europe. This was essentially a case of intensive resource extraction, as commercial incentives quickly led to overhunting. Growing scarcity led to conflict. Furs were exchanged for European technologies, especially weaponry, thereby completely radicalizing the nature of indigenous warfare, which now involved large-scale attacks and the destruction of entire villages. Take this case, for example. Overhunting by the Iroquois pushed them northwards into the territory of the Huron people, present-day Quebec and Ontario. The Huron were allied with French traders and Jesuit priests who limited their access to firearms, leaving them mostly defenseless against British and Dutch-backed Iroquoian raiders. A decades-long conflict culminated in 1649 when Iroquoian war parties and their European allies attacked Huronia, killing hundreds, destroying entire villages, and forcing survivors into exile. Sometimes colonial violence was more clear-cut between European perpetrators and Indian victims. In the early 1640s, the Dutch West India Company grew concerned as Lenape refugees from the Beaver Wars began congregating near Dutch settlements. On the night of February 25th, 1643, 80 Dutch soldiers sailed across the Hudson River from New Amsterdam and attacked a Lenape refugee camp at Pavonia, present-day Jersey City. They murdered 120 Indians in their sleep, hacked infants to pieces, and threw children down the Hudson. A century later, with the Anglo-American victory in the French and Indian War, colonial violence became increasingly one-sided and fell into a recurring pattern, with vigilante frontiersmen and settlers waging campaigns of terror. One notorious case was the so-called Paxton Boys, a settler militia from the Pennsylvania backcountry, who in the winter of 1763-64 moved from town to town, harassing and killing Indian refugees, chasing them all the way to Philadelphia, where public officials managed to calm the mob. Even though a worse disaster was avoided, the episode was an awful portend of settler radicalization. This was hardly the last time that defenseless Indian refugees were mercilessly killed by privately organized settlers. For example, the Ohio River Valley during the American War of Independence was a theater of war with genocidal proportions. Some Indian war parties allied with the British against the Americans. Others remained neutral. But colonial militias didn't always respect this distinction. On March 6, 1782, militiamen from Pennsylvania and Virginia attacked a peaceful group of Lenape refugees known as the Moravians, named after the German-American Protestant missionaries who promised them protection at the village of Gnadenhutten, present-day Ohio. 2 days later, well after the heat of battle was over and the town firmly under colonial occupation, the militiamen ushered their victims into slaughterhouses where they killed all but 2 of their captives. It wasn't just lawless frontiersmen committing genocide either. For instance, the Iroquois refer to George Washington as Conotocoris, or town destroyer, an inglorious moniker he earned during the American Revolution in upstate New York and the Pennsylvania backcountry, where he explicitly ordered the, quote, total destruction of Iroquoian settlements. Likewise, New York Governor George Clinton said that, quote, there could be no peace on the frontier until the straggling Indians and Tories who infest it are exterminated, end quote. Quite simply, during the period of the early republic, American leaders developed a clearly defined policy option for extirpating or exterminating indigenous groups who resisted American interests. After independence was secured in 1783, American settlers poured across the trans-Appalachian frontier, pushing the epicenter of indigenous settler violence further westward. Generally speaking, the Americans wanted indigenous peoples to cede their lands and simply disappear. If they balked, then US military operations focused on destroying Indian villages and crops. But in case such measures proved insufficient, there was always the more radical policy option. For instance, during the Black Hawk War of 1832, an American general intended to pursue one particular indigenous group and, quote, never cease until they are annihilated or subdued. The mere threat of extirpative warfare was simply a means to an end. American settler colonialism has always been about the land. What happens to indigenous peoples has been a secondary concern. By the 1830s, once the Americans had secured Eastern North America, the strategy of US Indian policy shifted to removal. Over the following decades, as many as 100,000 indigenous peoples were quote unquote removed to the West. The Cherokee removal in 1838 is the most infamous case, resulting in the death of nearly 1/4 of its entire population. And it was in this context, moreover, that the Lenape people were further dispersed into a continental-wide diaspora. After removals, the reservation system became the favored approach to dealing with the so-called Indian problem. Reservation lands are technically owned by the federal government, who act as a trustee by quote-unquote giving parcels of land to federally recognized tribes as domestic dependent nations. After the Civil War, the federal government used the allotment system to distribute land in the form of individual tracts of alienable private property, thereby resulting in the dispossession of millions of acres of indigenous territories. The federal government compiled tribal rolls in which eligibility for land allotments was based on the so-called blood quantum system. In fact, this system of identification is still in use today. As you can see here on this ridiculously complex graph produced by the federal government, the blood quantum is a fractionalizing measurement and a perverse form of racial arithmetic that effectively restricts who counts as sufficiently Indian. And there's a genocidal logic to this that I can elaborate in the Q&A session. By the late 19th century, once the frontier had been sufficiently conquered, the Indian residential school system emerged as a new technology of settler colonialism. According to one Canadian administrator, the system was designed to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question. The same idea was expressed more infamously in an 1892 speech by Richard Henry Pratt, a US Army veteran of the Indian Wars who had seen firsthand the cost and consequences of extirpative warfare as a strategic means to an end. Quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. I agree with the sentiment," Pratt said, "but only in this sense, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." The threat of elimination is not over. In this picture here on the right, we see Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Nation testifying in 2019 before a judge at the Bergen County Courthouse in a dispute with the township of Mahwah over religious rights and a zoning issue. 2 years ago this week, state and federal agencies took actions favoring the Ramapo. Although they're not recognized by the federal government, the Ramapo have been recognized by the state of New Jersey since 1980. And this status was recently reaffirmed, albeit under certain conditions that bar casino gaming rights. For all intents and purposes, this may appear to be a good thing, but what does this say about the Ramapo's inherent right to self-determination, given the fact that the power to confer recognition lies entirely within the structures of settler governance, and that their only recourse to justice is through the courts of the conquerors? The implication is that settler colonialism is still present. Now, for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip over the next few slides where I kind of speak more generally about the concept of genocide. how it was crafted to avoid dealing with these implications. I'll talk a little bit about Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the word, what his implications of his concept are for our discussion, and to try and forge some connections between the history of genocide against Native Americans and the Holocaust, particularly with this concept of the blood quantum and racialization. And I like this political cartoon and these pedigree graphs that are very similar to what the Nazis produced with the Nuremberg laws. So I'd be happy to discuss that further, as well as I think the bridge between the history of racism and settler colonialism in North America with the Holocaust is through the transnational eugenics movement. I can elaborate all of that, but I really want to end on this final point. Holocaust memory provides an ethical obligation for genocide prevention. And it is in this sense that the enduring history of American settler colonialism poses some serious implications. In fact, one of the most salient risk factors for future genocides is a history of prior genocides. Quite simply, this risk factor is very much present. I'm not saying that genocide is on the horizon in North America, but I do worry about what the future holds. So if we take seriously the mantra, never again, then we should start here at home. Thank you. Let's see, how do I get out of this?
Thank you very much. That was quite profound. I personally appreciate your focus and the details about my own homeland and people. Professor Malloy, would you like to have your presentation now?
I would. Now, let's see if
Wonderful.
I can share the screen without technical difficulties. There we go. It worked. It's a successful presentation once that happens. We're all set. Thank you for the invitation to join you. It's been Barbara. Thank you very much. Reverend Norwood and Jeff, thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm going to take some of what Jeff said and bring it down to a more localized level. And the reason I'm going to do that is the first things that I tell my students when I teach my genocide class is that there was no Native American genocide. And that gets an automatic reaction from them because they look at me and say, but there had to have been. And I said, well, but what if there wasn't? Because the term Native American is a homogeneous term. It doesn't recognize our individual tribal identities. And I tell them that there was a Cherokee genocide. There was a Lenape genocide. There was a Yurok genocide. There was a Seminole genocide. Because if we can bring it to that level, if we can begin to see that this is an issue of individual cultures and individual people that was perpetrated by the United States, we can get to that localized component that makes it real. When we talk about it in an abstract, it is something that is intangible. It is something that we can say, well, it just happened to this particular group. Because when you say this, and when you talk to students, when you talk to the average American, you say Native American, they sort of go right to that place that we've all been forced to look at. We look at the plains, we look at what is put before us in media. That's what we see. We don't see the people who are the original inhabitants of where we live. I am in California, so it's midday here. Sun's out, probably going to rain here in a little bit. But I'm in the homeland of the Wiyot. These are the original people from around Humboldt Bay. And I look at California because it is a very unique spot in North America in that it has the largest diversity of languages and cultures of any part of the continent. It takes me the same amount of time to drive from my home here to the border with Mexico as it would take those of you who are in New Jersey to drive to Florida. That is the vast expanse of this state. Here in Northern California, we're about an hour south of the Oregon border. We are world renewal people. Those are the Talawa, the Yurok, the Wiyot, the Wilkut, the Nonglottal, the Sinkion, the Matol, the Hupa, the Karuk. And by world renewal, what I mean is that our job that we were given when we were created here was to be constantly working for a balance in the world, to pray, to fast, to sing, to maintain the world in balance for all living people. Our ceremonial rules are strict. There's an incredible book of don'ts and a very small book of do's. We have to be able to walk into our ceremonial practices and sit down next to the person that we dislike the most in the world and have nothing but positive thoughts about them, wishing them the absolute best. And we're all human. We know how hard that is. But that is the essence of who we are. We are here. We were not removed. We are one of the few areas that did not suffer from removal. But we were the last place of contact in the United States. When we talk about how contact happened, we tend to think about it from the context of what happened on the East Coast and then the westward migration. Here in this portion of California, contact didn't happen until 1851. That means that there was only a 9-year period in which the genocide occurred here. So everything that took the rest of this country hundreds of years to go through happened here in a very compressed amount of time with a honed and perfected mechanism of destruction. Here we are only 3 generations away from those that I will be telling you about here shortly. We are dancers, we are singers. We pray for the world to be renewed. We pray for the health and balance of everybody. And my cousins to the north, the Talawa, who branch a little over into southern Oregon, their center of the world is a place called Yontaket. We have physical and spiritual centers of the world that are where we were created. And for the Talawa, they were brought forth on this world by the Creator in the village of Yontaket. And every year they gather there, as they've always done, to pray, to sing, to dance, to fast, so that this world will be better for everybody. In 1853, settlers from the nearby town of Crescent City, who had perceived a slight by the native people, elk and deer were bountiful here. They were part of the subsistence of all indigenous people in this area. But as settlers came in, those populations of food began to decline. Settlers brought in cattle. And that cattle quickly became a substitute for deer and elk. And what the settlers said was, look, these Indians are killing our cattle for food and not compensating us. So they gathered together and they went to Yontaket during the World Renewal Ceremony as the Talawa were praying for the world and slaughtered men, women, children, elderly. The Talawa fled into the Yontaket Slough, turning its waters red. Many of them ran into Lake Earl and drowned to escape the bullets. It is not just a physical death that occurs here. There is a deep spiritual and psychological wound that is incurred. At this moment, you have a people who are dedicated to balance in the world, dedicated to remaking the world as a better place, whose very religious and spiritual essence has been attacked. How do you continue to remake the world when the greatest violence you could experience occurs during that ceremony? The spiritual center of the world now becomes a graveyard. It becomes a mass grave of mourning. You can't remake the world in sadness and depression and sorrow. But how do you abandon that thing that you've been charged by the Creator to do? You have to work through that. You have to find a pathway to continue your obligations to maintain this world in balance. And the Talawa have worked hard. They have gone through the eras of termination when the federal government said they were out of the Indian business and tribal governments were no more. They have been subject to the loss of their reservation. They have been what we call restored, meaning they are now federally recognized once again and have a reservation. The Talawa have adapted. They now come together for Nadash, their world renewal ceremony. And before they begin the process of praying for the world, they memorialize those who were taken. From their oral tradition, from every record they have, they began to read the names of every Talawa that was killed in settler colonial violence. They put those names out there to mourn and to remember and to face the fact of what happened, not to let the wound fester, not to let that undermine their purpose, but rather to come together as a community and say, we can move through this, we can be better, and to dance and to sing and to pray. South of Talawa country is the homeland of the Wiyot, where I am. And then our bay is a little mud island called Talawat. And Talawat is where Old Man, the creator, sat the Wiyot. As he flew by, he placed them there. And he told the Wiyot, you are world renewal people. You are to pray and sing and dance for everybody. And they did. As they were praying in 1860, as they were their 10-day world renewal ceremony, very similar to what happened in Talawa country, they were accused of taking cattle, harming the economic interest of the settler colonists that had arrived here. On the evening of February 27th, the men left the island. They left to return to their villages to gather supplies, to gather what they would need for the remainders of the day. And during that evening, men from the city of Eureka made their way across the 1-mile channel to the island and slaughtered the elderly, women, and children. And they found 150 pounds of jerked beef in one of the houses and held it up as proof that these people had stolen from them, that these people had committed an atrocity against them. I don't tell you these stories because they're sad or to prove a point. I tell you because these are part of the local history here. These are what we know by living here. I pass Tulawat every single day when I go to work. You cannot miss it. It is right there in the middle of the bay. But these are the histories and the stories that are the basis of the creation of this nation, of our states, of our counties, of our localities. We do not hide the genocidal acts that occurred in this country. We put them right out in front, so we ignore them. Think for a second about how many times you walk past something on a given day and you don't see it. That's what we've done in this nation. We just put it right out there and say, eventually nobody will see it. There was a baby found alive on the island. He was being held in his mother's arms who had died. He was taken from the island, and like many of the Wiyot at that time, for their safety, they were moved to Fort Humboldt. And they were put in a 30 by 30 corral, opened air. We're extreme Northern California. We are not the sunny, sandy beaches of San Diego and LA. It rains here. We have more rain than sun. We have fog. It is cold. The survivors of the massacre were moved to an open air corral for their safety in the middle of winter. Another 30 to 40% of the population of the Wiyot were killed by exposure. That's what was done to protect them. You would think that for people who have suffered such an egregious atrocity, that they would lose the hope, that they would abandon what they were put here to do. But they didn't. They continued to work to rebuild themselves, to maintain their language, to keep their culture, to be present. And they did something rather phenomenal. In 1992, they invited the entire community, native and non-native, to come together on Woodley Island, which is just a little ways from Tuluwat. You can see it. And said, come together with us and let us hold a candlelight vigil. Let us come together to mourn all those who died and not point fingers at one another, not lay blame, but begin to work through this as a community. And they did this every single year, except for one, when we had torrential rains and 90-mile-an-hour winds, until 2014. They came together every year to do this. And it started off with a small group of about 100. And by the time it ended, there were 500 to 600 people that came together. And it moved this entire community forward. Because the island had fallen out of Wiyot control. It had been turned into private parcels. And because of that vigil, because of that communication with each other, that ability to talk with one another, to not lay blame, and understand that we have to somehow find common ground. And for the victim group to be the reconciler, rather than the descendants who benefited from the slaughter. To move that forward, the city of Eureka had taken possession of much of the island and did something that no other municipality in the United States had done. They transferred the island, their small portion of their holdings on the island, back to the Wiyot. In 2004, they returned 40 acres. 4 years before that, the Wiyot had gathered enough money to buy the 1.5 acre parcel that holds the village of Tuluwat. And on October 21st, 2019, the city of Eureka returned the remaining 202 parcels it held on the island. So for the first time in over 150 years, the Wiyot were the majority landholder of the center of their world. And you would think that there would be animosity in the community. There wasn't. The community celebrated. Native and non-native alike came together and said, this is the right thing to do. And the Wiyot danced. And they danced, and we cheered. Because it's that local level, it's easy to understand. We have a connection to it. We have a connection to the towns we live in. We have a connection to the counties we live in. We have a connection to the world that we see every day. And bringing this to the localized level, rather than this large expanse of a continent, makes it personal, makes it doable, means that we can move forward. The baby who was found on the island had children and grandchildren. And his granddaughter, Cheryl Seidner, who I am lucky to count as one of my dear friends, became chair of the Wiyot tribe and worked for its return. And when the island was returned, they just looked at the local paper, came to her and said, "What do you have to say?" And she's like, "It's our center of our world. Our ancestors have always lived there." She was taken across the bay in a redwood dugout canoe, the first time in over 150 years that a redwood dugout canoe had been on our bay. And she became the very first Wiyot to set foot on the island since the massacre. And I tell you this not for sympathy. I tell you this not for sorrow. I tell you this because if we can begin to look at what is going on in our local areas, we can effect incredible and amazing change. Because we have to accept the fact that the United States was founded on violence. And we see the repercussions of that foundational violence every single day. All you have to do is turn on the news. It's part of this nation. And until we begin to deal with our past and begin to heal those wounds, not just suture them, but heal them, we are going to continue to suffer from those injuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Malloy. We've had two wonderful and moving presentations. I see Professor Krasner has her hand up. Would you like to make comments, ma'am?
No, that was applause.
Oh, I'm still getting used to the icons. Okay. One of the things that I noticed in each of the presentations is a heavy consideration of a tie to the land and the history of the land and the interaction with the people of the land. And it's interesting, one of the observations that was made was how so often it is ignored some of the travesties and tragedies that occurred within a territory. And instead, what is celebrated, what is taught is the concept of triumphant colonialism and manifest destiny. Have you found, either of you, that it is easy to reintroduce the tragic truth? Are people typically willing to accept it? Are people, in your experience, at least in some way aware of it, but perhaps it is so far distant that it's not something that is perpetuated within the culture of a given territory?
Here, do you want to go first, Kerri, or do you want?
I'll let you go first. This was
Okay. I think it's important to recognize that we all suffer from this culture of violence. Even those of us who are beneficiaries of the system, and who by our backgrounds, are implicated in it, we still suffer. And I think, for example, I look at the water defenders at Standing Rock. They're on the front lines defending for all of us, for all of us and for all of creation, really. it's not just a tribal specific issue, or even a pan-tribal issue. They're fighting for all of us. And I think that's an important starting point. And I think it's a basis for reconciliation and for ultimately for decolonizing the world around us. As there's not, it's not about winners and losers. And that the normative position of the white settler society doesn't stand to lose out of this. There's a lot that can be gained by this process of renewal. And I think it's important to keep that at the forefront, so that we can kind of break out of this sort of natural, or the seemingly natural adversarial framework, because it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we can find a common struggle, really.
I agree with Jeff. We can find the common struggle. There's a dependence to how I answer your question, and I've been thinking about this. Is there are those who want to know this, who are looking for something different than what they learned in their history books, and then there are those who it's just uncomfortable. It makes them very uncomfortable to deal with this subject matter. And I think that's okay. I think uncomfortability is good. I think we all need to be uncomfortable at certain points in times. But there's a visceral reaction that comes from people, is when you lay this out for them. And as we all know, when our emotions take over, sometimes it's hard to control what happens. So you get those for like, I want to do something right now. And then you also get those for like, all you're doing is saying all white people are bad. And it's like, no, that's not actually what I'm saying at all. That's how you're interpreting it. But I don't actually ever say it like that. I try to tell them, look, we're all going to come to this on our own terms. And it's going to take some people longer. Some people, it's going to be easier. But generally, there's a willingness to at least explore it once they're able to connect it to something that they know. And if we can make that connection, we can move it forward. But I think it's hard. We're talking about undoing how many hundreds of years of U.S. education, which was primarily, not to traumatize anybody here, but if we want to go back to that history class, remember 8th grade history? I know, it's okay. Don't freak out about it. Remember, you studied Indians up to roughly 1890, and then they just disappeared. They were gone. And now we're saying, we didn't go anywhere, we're still here. And that can be really unsettling for people, is to have to face the fact that maybe those things that they've held dear, because we all hold certain things, piece of our education very close to us, may not actually be something we should hold on to.
In dealing with some of the difficulties in communicating the histories and the continuing challenges, the word genocide is potent and also provocative. And in using it to describe what occurred in North America on Turtle Island, do you see that there are limitations and benefits, challenges in using that term? I know that in some of my own research, there were colleagues for whom I had a lot of respect that were very uncomfortable using the term in regard to what happened here. What do either of you have to say about that?
Well, I teach Native American studies, and I'll be honest, I am a oddball in the system, because I deal with genocide all the time. It's primarily what I teach. And even within our discipline, across the board, they come out and say, we don't want to use the word genocide. We don't want to be victims. And I'm almost sitting there going, okay, if you don't want to be victims, but you want to claim something happened, and what do we do here? And I point to what we saw happen in Canada in June of 2019. I think it was June or July of 2019, when the Commission on Missing, Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls issued their report and found that under Canadian law, under the Canadian genocide statutes, that what is occurring to the Indigenous women in Canada is genocide. Canada freaked out. I did not know Canada was capable of freaking out like this. It freaked out. The newspapers went crazy because they didn't want that label. And I think when we use the word on both sides, whether you are the group that was victimized, it puts a burden on you. I mean, if we think about who's doing genocide education, it is generally those who have been affected by it. We have, first we're the victims, first we're the descendants of victims, and now we're the educators to stop it from ever happening again. But those who get the label put on them don't want it, because what greater crime is there? So there's a lot of controversy about it, and even amongst groups, it is controversial. And I think the more we use it and the more we refine it and really define what we mean, the further we can move this whole conversation.
In regard to having the conversation and incorporating it perhaps into the curricula, is one of the questions that I'm getting is California educating its students about accurate Native American history in California? Have you seen that? I know that your institution is among the first, Professor Malloy, to have a department dealing with this issue. But what about the rest of the state?
We're getting there is the best way to put it. So there's a couple of things happening. I'll try to keep it as short as I can. Is we have a statewide curriculum on Native people, on Indigenous people, that is voluntary for the school districts to adopt. Now, at the same time, we have an ethnic studies component that's working its way through our legislature that would require some form of ethnic studies in both middle and high school. And that's a little dicey because it could be any group versus just Native people. We also have a brand new piece of legislation which the entire California State University and University of California is attempting to implement by fall of next year, which requires every incoming student to take an ethnic studies course, of which one can be Native studies. It depends on the local tribal groups and how connected they are with the individual school districts and with the community colleges and with the universities and colleges. If there's a strong connection there, we're seeing that incorporation of history, those components are being brought together. In our areas where those bonds are not strong, we're not seeing it move forward there. What we have happening right now is California has recently, in January, we initiated the Truth and Healing Council, which is part of the state's apology to Indigenous people for what occurred here. That will run until 2024, and then they're going to issue a report. The hope is that out of that report, that out of tribal leaders and state officials working together, they will come out with some form of mandate that builds that component into our curriculum. So that's sort of where we're at. We're in a ebb and flow moment right now, and it looks like we have the momentum to move this further than we've ever done before.
Wonderful. One of the other questions that's coming through the chat, and I just want all of our participants to know that if you have questions, you can send them through the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And those that are similar, I'll try to summarize and group them together. One comment that came through is that we just had our first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior confirmed, Deb Hyland. And do you think that that is going to make any change or accomplish a benefit, either of you, for Native Americans?
You want to take that one, Jeff? I can sit back.
I certainly can't speak as any kind of expert on that, really. I could say it's my own personal I mean, certainly it's a very important symbolic step. I mean, hopefully it's more than just a symbolic gesture. You know, time will tell. I think it's important because the because her bureau is, excuse me, the Secretary of the Interior is actually, that's where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is housed, and she is the first Indigenous person, let alone Indigenous woman, to actually be in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Um, it is kind of, I think, revealing of the sort of settler colonial logic that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is housed in the same bureaucratic structure as, like, you know, land rights and mining, things like that. I mean, it's natural resources. You know, there's almost kind of a dehumanizing logic to that. So I think symbolically it's very important. Practically, in terms of, you know, material consequences, I mean, there are, I mean, obviously there are powerful forces arrayed against her in particular, let alone the sort of the movement that she represents. Um, yeah, I mean, powerful, very vested interest. You know, really talking about like large, you know, global structures of capitalism, frankly, that are not going to be just easily dismantled through symbolic gestures. Um, but, you know, yeah, I mean, symbols are important. They take time to have, you know, material effects and consequences. And so time will tell. You know, I guess, unfortunately, I don't know how much time we have when we think about, for example, like the climate crisis. Time's not exactly something we can afford. Um, but no, I mean, yes, I can't deny that the symbolic significance is very important.
Yeah, and just to clarify, uh, Deb Highland is the first Secretary of the Department of the Interior, but we've had at least three Native people who were assistant secretaries for Indian Affairs for the Bureau itself. But she's the first to be over it all, and certainly this is a historic event. An additional question, dealing with the term genocide that has come up in our chat, there is a history um, where there are some in the Jewish community that use the word genocide in connection to First Nations, and there are others who see it as a dilution of the meaning of the Holocaust and have an issue with it. Where do you fall on that, and how do you believe that perhaps the term cultural genocide is more appropriate, or does that dilute all that happened with Indigenous Americans? Either of you.
I think we have to.
I'm sorry, can I just qualify the question a bit? Because I wrote that question.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if there's the complaint often among the Jewish community. I'm from Vancouver, BC here, and I'm just finding being working on my PhD here and focusing on that area, that there's a lot of resistance. And Mr. Malloy, you referenced this as well. Canada's panicking, and I wondered, like, in the Jewish community here, there's a great resistance, that there's a fear that if we use the word genocide in connection to what's happening with First Nations here, that it is a form of diluting the experience of the Holocaust. And that I know what you were referring to when you talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and about the move towards preferring the term cultural genocide. So I was just curious what your thoughts are on if you do experience people, you know, the Jewish community resisting the term of genocide.
I've only run into it once, and it was with the director of the education arm of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That was the only time I've run into it, and of course it would have to be with someone in a very strong position of power. And we had a very good conversation about it, but I walked away from that conversation with wanting to know something, and he's retired now, but I've kept in contact with him, and people who know me know that if I have a question, I'll keep asking until I get an answer. And my question is, why are we competing for who suffered the most? Why are we in the oppression Olympics? Genocide is a term that describes the process of what happened. Each of group who has experienced that needs to be able to use that word because of the power in it. And if we relegate it to any one particular group, what we're saying is that nobody else could have ever gone through this. And we know that's not factual. History and everything we have in the literature tells us that's not factual, that this happened to multiple groups and is continuing to happen today. If we look at the Rohingya in Myanmar.
There was also a history of the relationship between what happened with the Nazis and what was done to the indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island. You want to comment on that, Dr. Benvenuto?
Oh yeah, sure. And Kerri and I have discussed this before. I mean, you know, you can look at Hitler's table talks and, you know, how he talked almost, you know, he relished, you know, like look at what, you know, the Americans did to the red man, you know, is sort of like a, you know, not necessarily a model, that might be kind of a gross oversimplifying it. But for Hitler, you know, he saw that there were what he perceived as laws of history, you know, that that others were already practicing. So what he was doing was no different, really. And, you know, there were other connections as well. I already alluded to the transnational eugenics movement in the first half of the 20th century. And, you know, it's those are direct institutional connections. You know, actually people that, you know, were going from back and forth between Nazi Germany and the United States. So very real connections, not just sort of abstract conceptual connections. And I can come back to that in a second. I do want to kind of just briefly just address the keyword dilution, and this dilution metaphor very common, you know, that if we, you know, if we talk about Native American genocides or any other genocides, it will somehow dilute the meaning of the word, which is, you know, it's an ironic word because the opposite of dilution is purity, which is obviously, you know, kind of a, you know, has its own genocidal implications. So, but, you know, if that's the case, if we're diluting the word from its, you know, pure meaning, well, what exactly is the pure meaning of genocide? You know, concepts are social constructs. You know, concepts don't just naturally occur. We don't just discover concepts in the world, you know, and discover their true essential meaning. Concepts are artificial. They're made by humans. And in the case of genocide, and I alluded to this in my presentation, the UN Genocide Convention was explicitly crafted in such a way to avoid any possibility of self-incrimination. It's not just with the Soviets emitting political groups. In terms of cultural genocide, yeah, it was the United States and other Western powers. And if you read the documentation from the time, not just the official UN documentation, but more revealingly, the internal State Department documents, for example, or, you know, the same with the UK and Australia and Canada. You know, they were all reporting back to their respective foreign ministries or whatever, saying like, you know, they're talking about, you know, and I do have to kind of back up a bit. The original concept of genocide, going back to Lemkin, was very broad. Cultural genocide was not a qualified form of genocide. It was genocide. Genocide involved cultural destruction. And that's how the original draft of the Genocide Convention was framed. It has a very broad conception. And they whittled it down throughout the drafting process as it became more and more politicized. I raise this history because, you know, was that the pure definition? This politicized document that was, you know, explicitly crafted in such a way as to avoid self-incrimination? You know, why can't Lemkin's definition be the pure definition? I mean, well, even that has problems as well. I'm not going to get into it. There is no pure definition. Genocide, like war, is a chameleon. It's mutable. It's a shapeshifter. It evolves and adapts, and it is in certain different forms in different contexts. You know, so that the Rohingya genocide, for example, going on, you know, or the genocide against the Uyghur people in China, looks very different from the Holocaust, for example, or for that matter, from Native American genocides. It really inhibits our goal of prevention if we maintain this fidelity to, this prototypical standard of what genocide should be. There's some pure definition. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with thinking about that pure definition. But to wrap back around to the original question, yes, the Nazi connection to America, to North America, I think eugenics is the place to find that connection. Yeah, very strong connection.
And Professor Malloy, in California, Governor Newsom has taken a little heat, and there's been a debate over the use of the term genocide in describing what happened in California to the indigenous populations there. And in his apology and the establishment of the Truth and Healing Council, what factors do you think first motivated the state to try to take responsibility? And do you think that there will be positive outcomes, or what I have seen all too often, once there is a formal apology, people kind of wipe their hands and say, well, that's done. We don't have to think about it anymore. Where are you on that?
I get that question a lot lately for some reason. It seems to be the question everybody wants to know. But so let's start how we got to the apology first. Ben Madley at UCLA wrote An American Genocide. It's a book. It has been called the definitive case that, yes, genocide happened in California. His work builds on that of Brendan Lindsay and Jack Norton. But really, Ben's book lays down a solid case that meets every criteria of the Genocide Convention. So what happened as that book got sent to the governor's office. Then it was Governor Jerry Brown. And Governor Brown read it and then had it distributed throughout his office, which is how it landed on then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom's desk. Governor Newsom made his apology. And what is interesting about the apology that has not been covered in the media is that if you look at who was invited to the apology, which tribal representatives and leaders were brought to Sacramento to that apology, it was, of course, the local groups around Sacramento. It was also the leadership of our most powerfully economically most powerful tribes. I'm a little cynical here because I've been following the Truth and Healing Council, and I was there on the call when Governor Newsom came to talk to the council. I worked for tribes for about 15 years. I have seen politicians come into rooms and how well prepared they are to give remarks, and they know whose hand to shake, they know who to talk to. He came into that meeting, the very first meeting of the council, unprepared. He did off-the-cuff remarks. I often ask my students when they propose something, are we doing this because it's the right thing to do, or are we doing this because it feels good? And if we're doing it simply because it feels good, then we're doing the wrong thing. There is no money, there is no commitment to carrying out the findings of the council. The conversation that is happening currently is that, very much like what happened with the Maine Wabanaki Commission, is that instead of the state moving forward, that will transfer to some sort of nonprofit that the tribes will fund. So once again, we're back to the victim group moving the reconciliation forward. So I don't mean to be cynical here. This is what I'm seeing, and it is sort of disturbing because we know that Governor Newsom has higher political office in mind. And he got a lot of really solid, good press out of the apology across the country. But we haven't seen him do much with it. Now, there are those who say COVID has interrupted that. But, if you look at, we've been doing this for a year now. You can continue to do the work even while dealing with this. He's got his own political issues here in California currently. But I think the real movement is going to come from the tribes. I think the tribes are going to say, we're not giving this up. We're going to continue to push this forward. And I think they will leave the state of California on the roadside and just say, okay, if you're not going to play and move, we're going to move you guys forward, whether you like it or not. I think that's what's going to happen. Just from knowing members of the council who are all sitting there saying, we need to do this. We need to heal. And that may mean that those who are trying to stand in the way or those who aren't really ready to do it yet just have to wait while the rest of us go forward.
Dr. Benvenuto, that in dealing with some of the challenges in having to confront this, having the governor make an apology and then show up to the first meeting not necessarily as prepared as he probably should have been, taking it as seriously as he could have. There's among those that have these reconciliation conferences, truth and justice commissions, there is still a sense of I shouldn't have to feel guilty for something that happened 300 years ago, without an understanding on its continuing legacy and continuing impact. What is the difference between guilt and responsibility?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very, because that's a common refrain, yeah, I could say, like, for example, my last name is Benvenuto, so at least that side of my family, they came over on a boat, from Italy in the 1890s or whatever, like they never killed any Indians, like how am I guilty, well, I think we should move away from the concept of guilt, which is, very much, well, I mean, I don't want to say move away, because let's say for all the missing and murdered Indigenous women, there are guilty parties, and they need to be brought to justice. So I can't say that we should just get rid of the concept, but at least in this conversation, talking about truth and reconciliation, and transitional justice, apart from those of us who are direct perpetrators and actually killing, for example, and raping Indigenous women, for example, for the rest of us, guilt isn't the right category, right? I mean, it's a very sort of legal concept. We are, however, responsible. And I mean, my response is this, simply, like, we choose to celebrate the 4th of July, right? Like we choose to celebrate, the cherished aspects that we've inherited from the past. So yeah, I mean, yeah, naturally we want to celebrate the good stuff, but let's not celebrate the bad stuff. Well, it's not like a cafeteria where you can sort of pick and choose what you want to do. I think it's kind of like, if if you're a member of society and you kind of, have inherited this transgenerational wealth, literally, often, in the case of settler society, wealth, or even just a legacy, it's the whole kits and caboodle. You got to take the good and the bad, and, yeah, with this country, we love George Washington. I mean, he's like the best, well, yeah, I mean, it's great. He never told a lie, and, about the cherry tree or whatever. But, I think we also have to think that, yeah, he was also responsible for an attempted genocide during the American War of Revolution, which itself is like the sort of, this great moment in American history. Well, I guess that depends on your perspective, and, look, it's not like to say that, well, this means that, oh, we just have to like start bashing American history, or we're trying to, destroy our legacy, which is often, a common refrain. Look, it's just being a responsible adult, like if you mess up in the past, you got to make amends for it, on an individual level. I think the same is true on a social or collective level. It doesn't mean you have to hate the country. You have to be, this, I hate America now, it's not like that, it's, I think it could actually be, that you love the country so much, from settler society perspective, that you love America so much that it's almost a patriotic duty to account for the sins of the past, to be responsible for it, to have a responsibility. Yeah, it's not to say that you're guilty, but you are responsible, I think.
And in dealing with the issues of responsibility, which I think fall to all of us responsible for striving toward reconciliation, identifying injustice, trying to correct it, that falls to every generation and to all people. have you found that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a useful tool in teaching what ought to be and how it should be? That's something that was presented in 2007, and I forgive me, I cannot recall which of the two of you listed the countries that were the last to sign on to it and initially voted against it. I know that the United States resisted, I believe, the longest. But among those that voted against it were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US in 2007. I think subsequently all have signed on to it with all kinds of disclaimers.
Right. Right. I mean, and it's important to recognize that it is a declaration and not a convention. That it is merely, and they were all, when all four of these countries eventually signed on, well, there's no actually real signing. It's just, you just say, oh, we support this. And they were all careful to say that, there are no legally binding obligations by doing this. And in fact, the way that the declaration was crafted, very much like the UN Genocide Convention, all legal instruments that go through the UN, there's a process, and it starts at the lower levels of the UN, and people, activists are responsible for these initial drafts, that are, very progressive. And then they go up the chain, they'll go up to the bureaucracy, and ultimately, it's member states that decide, not just, voting on whether we accept it or, but they craft the final language. And that was the case with the the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There were changes in the text, including, I call it an escape clause. I believe it's Article 42, I forget exactly, but it's an escape clause in the final text of the UN Declaration that very carefully protects the sovereignty of nation states and severely limits the right to self-determination effectively, even as it affirms Indigenous people's right to self-determination in Article 3. So, the UN Declaration, like all instruments in international law, is somewhat Janus-faced, two-sided. I think its original spirit and intent is a profoundly powerful document, and should indeed be used as not just an educational resource, but a legal resource to affirm Indigenous people's fundamental rights, including their right to self-determination. At the same time, yeah, I mean, the way that this instrument was crafted, it was designed to fit within the state-centric organizing principle of the world. And frankly, that's a limiting factor for all reconciliation efforts. I think there are limits. They're not going to be revolutionary. They will be ameliorative at best, or at worst, they can become instruments of co-option. So that you have these gestures like, Governor Newsom, for example, without actually doing the real work of restitution, particularly in the form of returning land. Even in the case of returning land, and Kerri, you and I have talked about this, and maybe, Kerri, I think I know the answer because we've talked about this so many times, but I want to ask the question. The return of the city of Eureka returned Indian Island to the Wiyot, but the Wiyot still pay taxes,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah, they're going to have to pay property taxes. So they got their land back, but now they got to pay the settler colonial structure,
Right,
for the right to own the land that's always been theirs.
right.
But you're raising an important point with the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. Is when Justin Trudeau was elected, became Prime Minister of Canada, one of the first things he said is Canada will fully implement UNDRIP. That hasn't happened. To my knowledge, Belize is the only country in the world that their Supreme Court has found that UNDRIP has actually usable legal principles and have applied it to the country. The rest haven't. And it's interesting about UNDRIP. It's the only other United Nations document that uses the word genocide.
Yep.
So that tells us something. that tells us that we recognize, at least at the international level, that genocide is still being committed against Indigenous people around the world, that we have to put it in a document that comes out almost 48 years after the initial Genocide Convention.
So in regard to we are going back to the island and having ceremony, they have been given the island, but they're not sovereign over it because they're paying taxes on it. Has that impacted the freedom of the tribe to do what they want to do? Does the city still subject the island to their zoning laws and codes, or is the tribe at least in control of that also?
Since it's fee simple property, so fee simple property is like any of us who own a home. It's not trust property. It's subject not only to, so the city owned the island, but the island was actually under the jurisdiction of the county. The city limits end right in the middle of the water. So the island is actually subject to the county of Humboldt's building requirements and rules. It's also within the California Coastal Commission's jurisdiction. So anything that happens on that island is going to have to go through multiple levels of review, both at the county planning level and then again at the state level, as to where if it were just trust land, they would be able to operate within their using the sovereignty under trust principles. They could do what they pretty much wanted with the BIA stepping in. It raises the question of, you know, if we are going to return land, does that also mean we have to return the jurisdiction over the land, free of the state or the county or the city? And that's where we get into the problem, because no one likes to lose control.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you for the wonderful presentation and insightful answers to our questions. Professor Krasner, I see we're coming to the end of our time together here. I want to turn it back over to you. I know you have some announcements that you want to make, but I was honored to be able to sit with everyone here, and it's been a wonderful experience, and God bless all of you. Professor Krasner.
Thank you, Reverend Norwood. First, I want to thank you and Jeff Benvenuto and Kerri Malloy for participating in tonight's program and giving us these very keen insights on Native American genocide. And, you know, through your talks, we get both coasts addressed. So obviously in New Jersey, we don't often hear about California. So it's good to be able to get that perspective. I just want to point to the chat where I've laid out some of our upcoming programs. So on April 7th, in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, we have a program, Refuge Denied. It's about the MS St. Louis. I'm actually on the panel as the author of a novel in verse that's coming out. And we have Scott Miller, retired Director of Curatorial Affairs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Hans Fischer, who was about 9 or 10 on the ship. And he is a professor emeritus from Rutgers. And then on April 20th, we have a noontime discussion with Dr. Raj Kaur. She's the Director of Asian Studies at William Patterson, and she'll be addressing anti-Asian discrimination. And April 22nd, we have Dr. Paul Bagazian of NYU, and he is going to discuss the Armenian genocide, but also the concept of genocide. And then at the end of May, May 27th, we have members of Third Generation New York. They are grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and they will be speaking to us about their grandparents' stories and how that shapes their present in, you know, in a different generation. For those of you who may be educators, we will host our annual Educators Conference virtually with Echoes and Reflection on June 3rd and 10th from 4 to 6 p.m. You'll be hearing more about that. If you're interested in any of these programs, please RSVP to hgrcenter@mccc.edu. I want to thank you all for your participation tonight. Thank you so much for coming and for making this program a success.